Hello and welcome to this video where we're looking at how to set up and use workflows using Workbooks and Gatormail, which is one of the tools from our marketing automation partner Spotler. Before getting into the how of setting up a workflow, let's take a look at why you'd use one and what a workflow offers. So why would you use a workflow? The main answer is so that you can take your audience on a journey and send different communications at different times depending on when or if different conditions are met. A simple example is this one. You identify your audience, and this is something that you specify within Workbooks and then sync into a group in Spotler, and I'll go into how to do that in more detail later. You then send that initial audience a campaign. You can include a condition in your workflow that checks whether or not the recipient has opened the email, and if they haven't, they can exit the workflow. If they have opened it though, they can be added to a new group, which we've called opened, but you can call it whatever you want. And then members of that new group are sent a different campaign. This is just a basic workflow and it's just a representation of one on a PowerPoint slide. But with some thought you can create more complex workflows. The conditions you use don't have to depend on the contact's interactions, they could just be time delays if you prefer. Gator Workflow provides you with a drag and drop editor that allows you to create links between Gator email campaigns and audience groups within Gator. It allows you to manage when you send a range of different emails. You can send different messages to different audiences, which are called groups in Gator. You can create the journey that I mentioned for the audience, which is made really easy by using that drag and drop editor. And you can get things done quickly because you don't have to set up lots of rules for each individual part of the journey. Finally, the workflow allows you to set up long-term campaigns because you can configure long-term flows. In this video, we're going to work through a very simple example that uses a time delay between sending two email campaigns. Imagine that your prospects can fill in a form on your website to sign up for a free 15-day trial of your product. On the day they sign up, you want them to receive a welcome email. After that, you want a delay of 12 days before sending them a second email reminding them that their trial is due to expire. In real life, you'd probably want a more comprehensive series of communications with them to guide them through the trial. But this video will help you with the theory and then you can introduce more complexity to suit your business needs. If you are planning a more complex workflow, I'd recommend that you draw out what you want to achieve, including all the entry and the exit points, as well as factoring in which campaigns you want to send. Drawing it out like that will make it much easier to put your workflow together. Let's look at the steps required to set up a workflow campaign. Firstly, you need to identify your initial target audience by building a Workbooks report. In our scenario, we want to email anyone who fills in our trial form. Obviously, we can't know who's going to do that in the future, so you might think it's difficult to build the report. However, if you're using Web Insights, you can build a report that looks at online activities, because every time someone fills in the trial form on your website, an online activity will be created within Workbooks, and the person or lead will be added to the report. Once you've got your report in good shape, you can create a dynamic mailing list in Workbooks that auto-refreshes from that report to ensure that as each new person signs up for a trial, they're added to the mailing list. You also need to mark the mailing list as being synchronized with Gator, although that won't actually happen until we complete a couple of more steps. Next, you need to move into Spotler, or Gator, depending what you're used to calling it, to set up something called a data sync. This enables Gator and Workbooks to share the data. You should give your Gator data sync the same name as your Workbooks mailing list. This process will automatically create a group in Gator. Next, you should set up the Gator campaigns that you want to include in your workflow. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to assume that you already know how to set up campaigns and also how to use Gator Creator to build your email content. Now you can create your workflow in Gator using the drag and drop editor and using your new Gator group as the entry point for the workflow and the campaigns you've just set up. Before going live, it's important that you test your workflow, and this means that you need to have initiated all the campaigns that form part of that workflow. Remember, the points in black on this slide are the things you need to do in Workbooks, and the ones in green need to be covered within Gator. So the first step is to build your Workbooks report. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to assume that you're familiar with the principles of building a report, but if you're not, I'd recommend that you watch our series of online reporting videos, which you'll find at workbooks.com/training/workbooks-reporting-training. That said, I will just run through a couple of principles, and then we'll move into Workbooks to build that report. Now you could start your report from people records or from lead records, but I'm going to start mine from online activities. If I did start from people, I'd still need to build a report starting from leads and vice versa. But if I start from online activities, they link to both people and leads, so I'll only need one report. You've probably got thousands of online activities in your database, so make sure that you add criteria so that the report shows online activities of type web form submission. Also, you don't need to contact people who signed up for a trial months ago, so you probably want to start from a specific date. You'll have different types of web form submission, so use a criterion to ensure the report shows the ones where it's the trial form that's been submitted. And you can use the action field for this. The exact value you need will depend on what your web form is called. Lastly, you're probably going to want to exclude certain people and leads from this workflow. You probably don't want to see people who work for your own company, or maybe people who work for your competitors or your suppliers. Similarly, you might want to exclude things that are from countries or possibly industry sectors that you don't supply to. The choices here are up to you, but I just wanted to flag up that you should apply some thought to who it is you want to enter your workflow. Let's go into Workbooks to build that report. Here we are in Workbooks. We need to build the report that is going to form our initial audience for the workflow. I'm going to choose a pre-populated report simply because it's got columns in it already, and I've mentioned that I'm going to base it on online activities. Now I know that one of the things I want to apply a criterion about is the field called action, and action isn't in my report. It doesn't have to be for me to use it as a criterion, but it's going to make life a little bit easier if I can see what the action is called, so I'm just going to add that column. And action will be over on the right hand side. I'm going to bring it further over to the left so that I can see it. In my report, I've got things going back years, which I don't want, so it's time to introduce some criteria. The first one I'm going to add is I'm going to look at the online activity type, and I'm looking for ones where the type was a web form submission. I'm also going to put in a date. You may be used to using the created at date in reports. For the purposes of an online activity, you need to look at the occurred date. When did this online activity when was it logged in effect? So I'm going to say it occurred after, and for me I'm choosing the 14th of July 2020. It'll be a different date for you. Don't be tempted, however, to use the functionality where you can say it occurred after today. Today in that context is a moving date, so after today is always tomorrow and beyond, and you won't get any results in your report because nobody has filled in the form tomorrow and beyond. So make sure that you use an actual date when you're setting up this report. And I want to introduce a third criterion. I want to say that the action, and you should say is, and write everything out. For speed, I'm just going to say contains free trial. But I do recommend that you put the whole thing in there. Save and close, and let's see what effect that's had on the report. That looks much better. I'll save and run that just so that you can see it. And you can see that we've got 18 rows of data in here. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we've got 18 people that we want to add as our target audience. You can see, for instance, that this name Darren Green appears multiple times. We don't want to email Darren multiple times, so we'll only have one audience member for each time that we can see Darren there. You'll also notice that because I built my report on online activities, in some instances what's been created as a result is a sales lead, so we can see some of those, but in others what we've got are people on our database, and that's why I wanted to start with online activities rather than people or sales leads, because I get to see both sets of data in this report. Now that we've got our report, the next step is to create a mailing list in Workbooks and add all the people and leads from the report onto that mailing list. You can call your mailing list whatever you want to, but remember that when you go into Gator and create your data sync, that has to have the same name as the mailing list. There are 3 different mailing list types that you can choose from, and you need to select Dynamic Mailing List because this is the type that you can set up to refresh from a report. You obviously need to specify which report you want to use and which view of that report. Then you also need to specify which column in that view holds the information that you want to add. When you're setting up your mailing list, you can only add members from one report, but once your mailing list exists, you can add members from other reports or different types of members, by which I mean you can add maybe people first and then go back and add leads. And that's exactly what we're going to do once we go back into Workbooks to create the mailing list. You also need to set up the frequency with which you want the report to refresh the mailing list. And of course, remember to make the mailing list syncable with Gator. It won't sync just yet because we haven't set that up, but if you don't make it syncable, then Gator won't be able to see the mailing list and the whole process won't work. So the next step is we're going to go into Workbooks to set up the mailing list. Here we are back in Workbooks, and to set up a mailing list you need to be in the marketing area, new mailing list. This is where you get a choice of 3 different types of mailing list. I'll give mine a name first of all. And it's a dynamic mailing list that I want to choose because that's the type that will refresh from the contents of the report. So the next thing is it's saying, well, which report? I called it workflow test. And which view? Well, I've only got one view. I've just got a details view, but if you had multiple, you'd have to choose the appropriate one there. And then which column holds the data that you want. Now you can see here that the report itself has got organizations, people and sales leads in it. I can only choose one of these, and I'm going to choose people. I'm going to go back later and add the sales leads. Then go over to the right and click on Add Members. And there's our mailing list there. If I go to the Members tab, there are 3 people already added to the mailing list. Back on the Main tab, I'm going to tick the Auto Refresh button. That's the one that says go and look at the report and refresh the contents, the members of this mailing list based on the results of the report. You can change how frequently that runs if you want. By default it runs daily. You might want to change this to hourly, every hour. Choice is yours. Remember as well that you do have to synchronize this mailing list with Gator. So use the drop down next to Synchronize With and choose Gator Mail. And I'm going to save that. Notice that on the Reports tab there's a 1 in brackets, and if I go there it tells me this is the report that is speaking to this mailing list. But remember there were some leads on there as well, and I want to add those, so I'm going to do that now. I'm going to click on Add Report. I'm going to use exactly the same report as I used before, my workflow test report. Again, I've only got the details view, but this time instead of selecting people, I'm going to select sales lead. And now when I go back to my Members tab, you can see that we've got leads on here as well as people. So we've got 7 rows of data. I mentioned earlier Darren Green, for example. We aren't seeing him multiple times. He's on the report multiple times, but we only want to see him once in the mailing list. So this is great. This is doing exactly what I want it to do. Now that we've got the report and the mailing list set up in Workbooks, you need to set up the data sync itself, and that automatically creates a group in Gator which is joined with the mailing list you created in Workbooks. It's quite an easy process to set up, but do remember to give your data sync the same name as your Workbooks mailing list. This will create the Gator group with that same name, although it is prefixed with the words sync group for. You also need to activate the sync by changing the state to enabled, otherwise it won't work. So let's go into Gator to set up that first data sync. Here I am in Gator, and to set up your Gator sync you do need to be in Gator Mail. I've got more than one instance of Gator Mail, so I'm just choosing my demo one. And once you're there, go to Tools and then Data Sync. You'll see any that have already been set up, but you need to click on Add New. Remember to give your data sync the same name as your mailing list within Workbooks, and give it a description so that anybody going and seeing this data sync later can understand why it was set up. You can actually copy an existing sync. I'm not going to do that. I'm starting from new, so use the Create New button. So here on the next screen we've got 3 tabs: Detail, Data and Mappings, with Detail highlighted. Detail is showing us the name that we've already entered and the description. They get inherited. The connector is Workbooks, so you can leave that. The schedule, how frequently do you want this data sync to run? It defaults to running every day, but you do have options here. You could maybe change this one to every hour, for example. Make sure that the checkbox next to Add to Group is ticked. This means that you'll also see a checkbox further down the screen next to Remove from Group. That means that if a person or lead is removed from your Workbooks mailing list, it will also be removed from the Gator group. You don't need to use the drop-down next to Group to select a Gator group, because the very act of setting up this sync will create one for you. So next you need to go to your Data tab, and here the only thing you need to do is tell the data sync which Workbooks mailing list you want to use, and use the down arrow. You should see your list. There's mine, Workflow Test. If you don't see it in the list, then do click Reload Mailing Lists and try again. If you still don't see it there, go back into Workbooks and double check that you made your mailing list syncable with Gator. The third tab is the Mappings tab. You shouldn't really need to change anything in here. In fact, I'd advise that you don't, because anything you change here will also affect any of the mappings you've got set up for any other synchronizations between Workbooks and Gator. So at this point, all you need to do is save. And finally, you need to make this sync active, and you do that using the Change State button towards the top of the screen. If you look further down, you can see the sync status at the moment says there's a little blue circle and it says the sync's being designed. We're going to use the Change State button at the top and change the state to enabled. It's the only other option we've got, and click on Change State. If I go back to Tools, Data Sync, or if I just click Close, I'll be taken back to the screen that gives me the list of my data syncs. The Workflow Test one here, you can see that the sync is still transitioning to another state. Give it a moment or two, and what will happen is that you'll see that green circle showing you, like these other ones, that the sync itself, the state of it is enabled. There we go, my one's ready to be used. The next step is to create however many campaigns you need in your workflow, along with the associated content, which for us is these two, the welcome and then the "you're nearing the end of your trial" email. As I mentioned earlier, this video assumes that you do know how to create your campaign, so I'm not going to go into detail, but it is worth mentioning that you need to create traditional campaigns rather than quick ones, and the type of the campaign should be follow-up/workflow campaign, with an action type of static. If this doesn't mean anything to you, you probably need to spend a bit more time familiarising yourself with Gator campaigns before trying to build any workflows. Once you've got everything in place, you can build your workflow. Here's a screenshot of what the editor screen in Spotler looks like. The grey background is your design canvas, onto which you can drag and drop the elements in your workflow. On the left is your settings panel, and this is where you can do things like zoom in and out of the canvas and edit the basic settings of your workflow, such as adding a test email address or saving the workflow, changing the workflow state. And by that I mean moving it from a design state into a test state, not dissimilar from what we just did with the data sync. You can see the name of your workflow, although you actually set that up within the settings panel. And then you've got what we call your stages and blocks, and these are the things that you can drag onto your canvas to create your workflow. Let's go back into Spotler to set up our workflow. Remember, we want anyone who's signed up for a free trial to receive an email when they sign up, and then after a wait period of 12 days, we want them to receive the second email from us. Okay, so in Spotler we need to set up our workflow, but before I go over to Gator Workflow at the top here, what I just wanted to show you was that I have set up a couple of campaigns already that are going to be our first email and our second email. They're not named very imaginatively, I'm sure you do a better job of that, Workflow Test 1 and Workflow Test 2. You can see if you hover over here that they are both traditional campaigns, and remember that they need to have been initiated, and these two both have. So that means I can now use them on my workflow. So I'm going to go to my workflow. You've probably only got one instance, but for me I need to make sure I'm in my demo one. I don't think you'd need me to encourage you to click on Create a Workflow if that's what you want to do. And this is the design screen that we were talking about earlier. So the first thing we need to do is think about who is it that we want to enter this workflow, and it's the group that has the members in it that are on the mailing list in Workbooks. So if you start by dragging this group onto the screen, and it says which group. Here's one called Sync Group 4, Workflow Test. Remember we called our data sync Workflow Test, and I mentioned to you that that would automatically create a group prefixed with the words Sync Group 4. So that's the one that we actually want to use, and we can click OK. That's our starting point. Every workflow in Gator must have at least one entry point, that's what this one is, and it must have at least one exit point. And now you just build up the picture of what it is that you're trying to achieve. So for us, I'm going to expand Gator Mail and say send email campaign, because that's the first thing I want to happen. And it says which campaign. So my workflow test 1, my welcome to the Workbooks trial for me. Click OK. You can line these things up if you want to. You don't have to, it just makes it a little bit easier on the eye if you want to. Then we know that we want a wait period of 12 days. So that appears under the decisions section here. So here's the wait, it's got that kind of pause symbol on it, and again you can drag it onto the canvas. And it says wait until a time period has been reached. You've got some other options here. You might want a specific date that has gone past. I'm just going to say a period of 12 days. You can be much more granular, you can say hours and minutes, depends what you need to achieve. So I'll pop that on there. And then after 12 days for me, I want to send my second email. So go back to the Gator Mail option, drag send email campaign over here, and this time I'm going to choose my workflow test 2. See, I like my things lined up where possible. And remember, I mentioned that we have to have an exit point. I'm going to go to the decisions and exit. You can give what's called an exit value to people leaving this part of the workflow if you want to. That can be used to initiate other workflows if you want. I'm going to make this very simple and just click OK. You will need to explore the different options that you've got in each of these sections, particularly I think around the decisions, the sorts of things that you can do, but also around Gator Mail itself. For instance, campaign journey. You might want to send the members of your workflow a series of Gator Mail campaigns, one campaign each time they enter the stage. You might want to add them to another group, a group of your choice, the group that opened the email, for example. In actual fact, we don't really advise that you use the add to group or the remove from group options here. It's because of your Workbooks integration and wanting there to be one source of truth within Workbooks. The store contact value, that retrieves an attribute from a member's contact record and stores it in a named location for use later in the workflow. And you can set a contact value. This allows you to set a value in the member's contact record within Spotler that writes back to Workbooks. Turning our attention, I know this is a quick going over, I want to keep this as simple as possible for this video, but just wanted to mention some of the options here. Within the decisions reveal, you've seen the wait one, because we've just used the wait for 12 days, and you can see that can be hours and minutes if you prefer. Then you've got the condition here. This tends to be used after an email send block. When a member is sent an email campaign, you can change how they move through the workflow by setting a rule on the condition block. So for instance, if they clicked on a particular link, take them to a different step in your workflow. Again, we've got store value. What this does is stores a named value into a named location for use later in the workflow. Execute expression. This executes an expression that you create and stores the result of that expression in a named location associated with the specific workflow member. This is getting into much more complex stuff, as I'm sure you can appreciate. But this approach can be used for multiple functions. For example, you might want to combine Gator lead scores for certain pages and provide an overall value. Send notification. This block allows you to send a notification to specific email addresses when a member has entered or exited a stage or met a specific condition. Go to stage allows you to send a specific member straight to a specified stage in your workflow, and exit you've seen. And just remind you, you must always have at least one entry and one exit point on all of your workflows. Something that's really important to remember is that workflows don't auto-save as you go. So if you click off and go somewhere else now and forget about this for a while, your work will be lost. So I do encourage you to click on Save the Workflow. And this will say, well, I can't save it unless you give me a name. I'm just going to call my workflow test. You'd, of course, have a much better name for yours. You can put in notes to remind you what the workflow is all about. That's absolutely fine. What is important is that you put in one or more email addresses that you can use to test this workflow when you're done with it. I'm not quite ready to test mine yet, but I will put in here my Workbooks email address so that when I'm ready to test it, I can use that email address. If you want to put multiple email addresses in, just put them on a new line. And here's the start date for my workflow. You can change that. You could set this for next week if you don't want it to start straight away. Similarly, you've got an end date. After the end date, nothing will flow through this workflow at all. And just for neatness sake, you can file, if you like, your workflows in different places. I probably don't need to click save again, but I'm going to because I don't want to lose anything. The cog button, you've seen a button that looks very much like that when we were doing the data sync. This is how you change from the current state of this workflow. You'll see the blue circle at the top. The workflow is in a design state at the moment. But the next step that we want to do is test this workflow. So I'm now going to click on this. It thinks I maybe want to push it live, but I'm not ready to push it live yet. I want to test it. You can also see here that it will remain in test for 24 hours. If you don't manually change it to either live or back to design, after 24 hours it will automatically return to the design state. So the request to change the state has been submitted. It's not just ready quite yet. That might take a moment or two. My workflow has now changed state. You can see there's an orange circle next to it. Don't worry, it says this workflow is published -test. It means it's in a testing state at this moment. It hasn't gone live. To test it, use this Go to Analysis button here, and when you do, it'll change what you can do over on the right. At the moment, if I hover over the group entry, I can see a search button, but that's all. If I click on Go to Analysis, and go back over to my group entry, now you can see there's a little person symbol and a plus. If I click on that and put in the same email address that I entered before for testing, then I can add that workflow member. That's going to go into a queue, and what's going to happen, it's going to push that member through the workflow to test it for me. You can see straight away it says completed members 1. It's very tiny, I hope you can see that. Let me zoom in slightly for you. Yeah, completed members 1. So that one test has entered the group. It's now, whoops, move this up a bit for you. It's now saying it'll send this first campaign. It's still in that state. So I'm going to wait until this says completed members equals 1. So now it says completed members 1. And you can see that that member has now gone into this wait element of the workflow. The problem is, of course, we don't actually want to wait for 12 days. That would be a bit crazy. It would take you far too long to test your workflows. So the good news is that you can advance people through workflows. And you can do it by going on this left-hand panel, this analysis section. If you go to the Members tab, here I am. And you can see the current stage is the wait for 12 days, but there's an action button on the right hand side. And what you can do is advance the member. You can also do things like pause the member or remove them if you want to, but I want to advance them onto the next stage. So that's the choice I'm making, and it's telling me that that request has been submitted. It won't happen instantly, but it certainly won't take 12 days. So just wait until that member has transitioned through the wait period. We can see now it says completed members 1. So my test record has gone through that wait period and is now active within my workflow test 2, my second campaign. And similarly, if I look on this analysis screen and look at my test person, you can see which stage they're currently at. And you can refresh that screen if you want to. And we can see now that I've reached the exit stage in the workflow. Hasn't quite completed through, but it's nearly done. And there we've now got completed 1. So of course the next step would be to go and check that the right emails have been sent, that they look good, that you're happy with what's happening. accepting that you've obviously accelerated the process in terms of timings. If there's anything wrong with what you set up, you might need to go back and alter it. When I say alter it, I mean amend the workflow itself. To do that, you would have to change the state of it first. You would have to go to the editor and go to change the state, change it back to a design state, make your changes and come back and test again. When you do come to test again though, what you'll find within the analysis on the members tab is that the record you've already pushed through the workflow is showing there. So in order to use that particular email address again for testing, you would now have to use this option which says remove member allowing re-entry. So that's the two things you'd need to do. Change the state to design, fix your workflow, change what's happening, change the state back to testing and remove the member and start again with that, pushing them through the process to test it again. And you can do that as many times as you need to until you're happy with the way that the workflow is hanging together. And no prizes for guessing that if you are happy with the testing, then you can publish this live, and you just go to editor, and you've seen this already, but you go to the cogs and it assumes you want to push it live. You'd go back to design if you wanted to amend that design, but pushing it live and clicking OK makes it live instantly based on the start date of your workflow. What we put together there was a very simple workflow with no decision points in it. However, there are lots of possibilities for what you might like to set up, a handful of which are shown on the screen here. Maybe you want to use your scoring system to control what sort of communication to send to a lead. With invitations to events, you could send different reminders about the event depending on whether or not the recipient clicked on the link in the original email, and maybe a last chance to register email to people who haven't signed up a week before, but we're looking forward to seeing you type of email to those who have registered. In the third example, maybe you've got some customers who don't seem very engaged with you. Perhaps their total Web Insights score is high, but they haven't interacted much recently, and you want to reinvigorate their interest. You could send different communications depending on their level of recent score. As I said, you really do have endless possibilities, but here's a quick recap of what you need to think about. Start by drawing out your workflow. You'll struggle to build it in Spotler if you can't describe what you want to achieve. Use a report in Workbooks to identify your starting audience. For us, it was a report on online activities, but you might have other drivers such as the Web Insights score. Use your report to populate an auto-refreshing mailing list that you make syncable with Gator. Those steps are all carried out in Workbooks. Next, go into Gator and set up your data sync, giving it the same name as your Workbooks mailing list. If you haven't already, then create the campaigns that form part of your workflow. You don't need to give these campaigns audiences, as the workflow is going to determine the audience based on the way that you set up the workflow itself. You should, though, make sure that you set up traditional campaigns rather than quick ones, and give them a type of follow-up/workflow campaign and an action type of static. Next, go and build your workflow, making sure that you have at least one entry and one exit point. And before making your workflow live, carry out testing. If you need to modify the workflow, change the state back to design, make your changes and retest. And then only once you're happy with all the steps in your workflow should you make it live. And of course, those steps 4 to 8, they're all carried out within Gator. So thank you for watching this video, which I hope you found useful. There are lots of resources out there, both from Workbooks and also from Spotler. I would recommend that you go to our knowledge base at workbooks.com/help, and you can see a couple of options there. There's /setting-gatormail-workflows, and there's also Spotler-data-sync.